Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is portfolio questions on finance, employment and sustainable growth. Question number 1, Mary Scanlon.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking in light of the findings of the Audit Scotland report managing early departures from the Scottish public sector.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, as the Audit Scotland report highlights, many public bodies have decided to run voluntary exit schemes as one way of reducing costs at a time when the UK Government has made significant reductions to the Scottish budget. Voluntary exit schemes deliver significant year-on-year savings to the public purse, while providing public sector staff with security of employment at an economically challenging time. Under the current Civil Service Compensation Scheme, costs are recouped in 2 years, with recurring annual savings thereafter. As an example, estimated savings from the Scottish Government's own voluntary exit schemes between 2009-10 and 2011-12 amount to around £73 million per year. The report provides a useful reminder of the principles of good practice in managing early departures and confirms that bodies across the public sector are applying those principles. I would encourage all bodies to reflect on Audit Scotland's advice to help ensure we continue to demonstrate best practice in this area.
Mary Scanlon.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for his response and for emphasising the principles of good practice, which I am sure we would all agree with. Can I ask why the Scottish Government approved the Scottish Enterprise Early Departure Scheme when it did not meet the guidance in the Scottish Public Finance Manual and resulted in the average cost of early departure for Scottish enterprise employees being almost £100,000 more than the average for employees of the Scottish Ambulance Service? Cabinet Secretary.
Can I make 2 points in response to Mary Scanlon's question? The first is to say that Scottish Enterprise has made clear that there are certain concerns that they have about the presentation of some elements of the information that has been supplied by Audit Scotland that they consider could confuse the reader about the facts and the substance behind the point, so that is a point that I put on the record. Secondly, one of the factors that would be material to the Scottish Enterprise position being different from other aspects of the public sector is, of course, all of these voluntary severance schemes must respect the terms and conditions upon which members of staff have been employed. And in some circumstances that will be, well, inevitably it is different between one public sector organisation and another. So there will not be uniformity on those terms and conditions, which will explain why there are some differences in the settlements that are arrived at, because they are driven by the requirements of contractual terms, which I'm certain Mary Scanlon will understand all public sector bodies must respect.
Ken Macintosh.
Thank you. The Audit Scotland figures appear to be even worse than Labour's own FOI investigation, and it would seem that the Scottish Government are spending more than 10 times as much putting people out of work than they are getting them into work. Can I ask, the report specifically criticises early departure schemes that are driven by short-term budget cuts. Can I ask the Finance Secretary what his plans are for the long term for the public sector workforce?
Cabinet Secretary.
I've not, in all of Ken Macintosh's contribution on this subject, I have not been able to understand what he would like us to do. Because we face reductions in public expenditure, nobody can dispute that, and we have an obligation to make the public finances sustainable. Unfortunately, that has required us to engage in some voluntary redundancy measures across different aspects of the public sector, and that has been done where a business case has been proven to deliver long-term savings to the public purse. And the Audit Scotland report, if I can quote from it, Presiding Officer, early retirements and voluntary redundancies can be a useful way of avoiding the delays and costs of compulsory redundancies and quickly reducing staff numbers and costs. Once the initial outlay has been recouped, they can provide significant savings for organisations, and that is about making the public finances sustainable. Now, if Mr Macintosh, who, by the way, has never made a representation to me in the budget asking for me to put money in place to avoid any of these voluntary redundancy schemes, because people would have to be paid if they were still employed in the public sector. So I'm at a bit of a loss to understand exactly what the Labour Party's position is here. What I would say finally, Presiding Officer, is the Government has given clear and consistent reassurance to public sector workers that we do not support and will not implement compulsory redundancy programmes, and that is a strength which I think is acknowledged by the Audit Scotland report.
Sandra White.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary and others have mentioned the Audit Scotland report and obviously the voluntary redundancy situation. Now, does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that the SNP Government's policy of no compulsory redundancies is providing staff with employment security at a time when unprecedented cuts to Scottish budget is coming from Westminster?
John Swinney.
Well, I went through some of the issues involved in Sandra White's question just a moment ago, that the Government has given an assurance on no compulsory redundancies to public sector workers who are employed by us, recognising the fact that that provides a better employment climate, and as the Audit Scotland report suggests, actually is a more efficient manner than undertaking compulsory redundancies, which of course have been argued for by some others in the debate. The second point I would make is that the manner in which we have gone about trying to sustain workforce engagement in a difficult time of economic and financial pressure, I think has resulted in the public sector workforce remaining strong and resilient in very difficult economic times.
Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Is the Cabinet Secretary familiar with paragraph 57 of the Audit Scotland report, which comments on the use of compromise agreements in respect of their use to silence whistleblowers? Is he aware this morning that at the Audit Scotland Committee, at the Audit Committee meeting, the Auditor General could not tell Parliament how many of these compromise agreements had been used of the 14,000 members of staff who have left the public sector over the last 2 years? Would he be able to enlighten Parliament as to what that figure might be?
Cabinet Secretary.
I don't have in front of me the precise number, but I'm happy to write to Mr Scott with any available information. I think, if my memory serves me right, I think we have responded to information requests on this point, but my memory may be letting me down on that point, but I will confirm that to Mr Scott. What I would say is that compromise agreements can only be used where there is an overwhelming justification for such an approach to be taken. They will be undertaken with the interests of the public purse in mind, and the Government will only embark on those approaches and those initiatives where the conditions merit such a case. I can say to Mr Scott, in relation to the number of cases, these will be a very small minority of the number of cases of individuals who have left the employment of the public sector.
Thank you. Before we call the next question, I must make a plea for shorter questions and answers, or we will not make much progress. Question number 2, Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how economic impact can be considered more fully in the planning system.
Minister Derek Mackay.
The planning system has a key role in supporting sustainable economic growth, both through the provision of up-to-date development plans and providing a supportive business environment for investment. Economic benefit, particularly job creation, should feature as a significant material consideration when making determinations on individual applications. The draft Scottish planning policy, open for public consultation until the 23rd of July, invites views on appropriate measures to support sustainable economic growth and economic recovery, and responses will help inform the finalised policy, which is due for publication and implementation by the end of the year.
Annabel Ewing.
I thank the Minister for his answer, and I hear what he says, but the Minister will be aware that some investors do query how much weight is actually given to economic impact in any given planning application. And can I ask the Minister, therefore, to clarify what difference the Scottish Government's proposed planning policies will make in this key respect?
Minister.
The SPP review will draw out that as a very important issue, and I have some sympathies with what the member has raised. And that's why economic impact must be taken more seriously, must be given clarity in the determination of any and consideration of any planning application, because it's very important at this time of economic recovery that the planning system supports sustainable economic growth, fully considers a matter of economic growth, considers the issue of growth and displacement to ensure that the planning system is supporting that competitive business environment that we all seek to create. So it's about leadership, culture and policy clarity, and I believe that's what the draft of the planning policy will conclude, and I'm supported in this by none other than the CBI, the Chamber of Commerce and the Federation of Small Business.
Question number 3, Graham Day.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what the impact has been of the 85% funding floor for local authorities.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the introduction of the 85% funding floor will provide Aberdeen City and the City of Edinburgh Councils with additional resources over the three-year period 2012 to 2015. This delivers on the Scottish Government's commitment to introduce a new funding floor to ensure that, as part of the outcome of Spending Review 2011, no local authority would receive less than 85% of the Scottish average in terms of revenue support.
Grundy.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Can I ask if he agrees with me that, given the financial pressures it faces, not the least of which being the unprecedented budget cuts from Westminster, that any reasonable person would recognise that the Scottish Government has provided a fair settlement to local government?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think it's best to consider this issue in terms of the statistics, Deputy Presiding Officer. In relation to the period between 2007-8 and 2012-13, the Scottish Government's resources at its disposal increased by 6.4%. The resources available through Scottish Government funding to local government increased by 8.9%. So 8.9% for local government, 6.4% for the Scottish Government. I think that demonstrates that local government in Scotland has been given a very fair settlement by the Scottish Government.
Briefly, please, Jenny Mara.
The Cabinet Secretary says that it's 85%, but does he recognise that instead of 85%, figures provided by SPICE show that Aberdeen City Council's funding settlement for the current year is not even 80% of the Scottish average? And will he confirm that the difference between the funding Aberdeen was promised and what it gets is £20 million for the current year?
Cabinet Secretary.
Let me just refute what Jenny Mara has said. The Scottish Government has explained repeatedly to Parliament that the calculation around local government settlements is made at the time of the spending review. At the time of the spending review that was established, the 85% funding floor was applied and presented right throughout the 3 year of the spending review, and it will be delivered and guaranteed for the City of Aberdeen. I have to say that Jenny Mara, raising this issue with me from the Labour benches, has got a heck of a brass neck. Let me quote Gordon Matheson, the leader of Glasgow City Council. As quickly as we work to protect schools, jobs and the vulnerable of this city, Glasgow, the SNP government bleed money away to other parts of the country for political gain. They have given up on Glasgow and decided to concentrate the nation's resources on winning Edinburgh and Aberdeen for the SNP. So there we are. We've got the Labour Party pointing in two directions and representing a government that for 8 years did absolutely nothing, not a thing, to address the funding challenges of Aberdeen City Council.
Question number 4, Anne McTaggart.
To ask the Scottish Government what recent work it has carried out in partnership with the Glasgow Council for Voluntary Sector.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, Glasgow Council for the Voluntary Sector is part of Glasgow's third sector interface. This provides a single point of access and support to the third sector in Glasgow. In 2013-14, we have allocated over £460,000 to help the Glasgow interface develop volunteering and social enterprises, grow a strong local third sector and build the third sector's relationship with community planning. GCVS, as part of the interface, has supported the distribution of Glasgow's Reshaping Care for Older People's £700,000 Transformation Fund, and GCVS also successfully applied for funding in year 1 of the Reducing Reoffending Change Fund.
Anne McTaggart.
I thank the Cabinet Minister for that response. In June of last year, the Government published an Action for Jobs Supporting Young Scots into Work initiative, which highlighted the importance of the third sector in Government's plan to address the growing unemployment. With an estimated youth unemployment rate of now over 16%, is the Cabinet Secretary satisfied the objectives within that report are being met?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think what I would say to Anne McTaggart is that clearly there is a significant issue in relation to youth employment in Scotland today. That was why the Government took the action it took to establish the specific ministerial responsibilities that are taken forward by Angela Constance in tackling the issue of youth employment. And the statistics demonstrate that we are making significant progress in reducing the levels of youth unemployment and boosting youth employment within Scotland. What I would say to Anne McTaggart, however, is that we are only part way through that exercise, and I think there needs to be an intensified focus, which I'm certain the third sector in Glasgow is contributing to ensure that we complete the tasks that are involved in ensuring that we create the necessary opportunities for young people in our society, and that we tackle the level of youth unemployment in the most effective way we can.
Question number 5, Graham Pearson.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what discussions the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth has had with the Cabinet Secretary for Justice regarding the allocation of Barnett consequentials for Police Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Barnett consequentials accrue to the Scottish Bloc as a whole, and ministers take collective decisions about their allocation.
Graham Pearson.
Thank you for that reply. Presiding Officer, in that context, therefore, did the Cabinet Secretary's colleagues give any consideration to the allocation of a portion of the accumulated police reserves to the Scottish Police Authority to support the organisation in managing its initial budgetary challenges, particularly related to the implementation of the national IT systems so necessary to enable a single police service to operate in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
That consideration would not have been necessary because the Government, as part of the process of establishing Police Scotland, has given full consideration to the funding requirements of Police Scotland in taking forward the necessary work to establish the single police force. That whole initiative has been taken forward by the Scottish Police Authority and by Police Scotland, and the Government will, of course, continue to engage in dialogue with the essential partners in that process as the implementation of Police Scotland is taken forward.
Question number 6, Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taken to strengthen single outcome agreements as part of its response to the Commission on the future delivery of public services.
Minister Derek Mackay.
Community planning and single outcome agreements are at the core of the Scottish Government's approach to public service reform. Following the Christie report, we in COSLA agreed a statement of ambition setting out our shared aims for community planning and providing the basis for action to achieve those aims. That action includes requiring single outcome agreements to set a clear vision of what each community plan partnership wants to achieve for its area, include a sharp focus on key policy priorities and show how each CPP will deliver prevention and the other pillars of public sector reform. All 32 CPPs have now submitted new draft SOAs, and a process of assurance involving senior managers from across the public sector will commence shortly. The process will identify specific development and improvement actions for each CPP that will form part of the agreement of the SOA.
Richard Lyle.
I thank the Minister for that answer. I note the recent Weathering the Storm report from the Carnegie UK Trust praised Scotland's adoption of an outcomes-based approach across the public sector. What assessment does the Minister make of this report?
Minister.
Well, I think we've had a range of reassurance that shows that the Scottish Government has been leading the way in terms of tackling inequality in our preventative spend agenda and on focusing on community planning. I think new developments such as the proposed extension of the legal duty, working closely with the Accounts Commission, the National Group, will deliver a focus on place, partnership and performance. And maybe that's why the advisers to the UK Government who advise on issues such as early years has commended the Scottish Government as leading the way in terms of prevention and early years work.
A very brief supplementary, Mary Scanlon.
Yes, can I ask if the new draft single outcome agreements will include a measure for well-being?
Minister.
In terms of the national measurements and the outcomes, of course, it's not just GDP, economic value, but a range of indicators that are taken into account to consider what progress we're making both nationally and locally. And so the local SOAs will have indicators that cut across a range of areas and focus very specifically on quality of life as part of the consideration around a sense of place. So yes, there are a range of indicators that I'm happy to share with the member to give her further reassurance.
Question number 7, James Kelly.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had since March 2013 with the Two Sisters Group regarding the future of Vion and Cambuslang.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, since March 2013, Scottish ministers and officials have had regular discussions with the Two Sisters Food Group regarding the future of Vion and Cambuslang.
James Kelly.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. I'm glad that he's been able to have regular discussions with the Two Sisters Group, because that is something that I and my parliamentary colleague Tom Greatrix have had difficulty in establishing. 2 months down the line, there still lacks a bit of clarity as to what the Two Sisters Group's plans are for Vion and Cambuslang. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, in terms of his discussions with the group, whether there has been any commitment of practical and financial support from the Scottish Government to the Two Sisters Group to continue to support operations at Vion and Cambuslang?
Cabinet Secretary.
The first thing I'd say to Mr Kelly is that I certainly will do what I can to encourage dialogue with the group. I think it's important that local members are able to have that dialogue. Secondly, the Government has made an offer of financial assistance to the Two Sisters Group, but it is conditional on sustaining levels of employment involved in the current operations that have been acquired by Two Sisters Group. The issues in connection with that are obviously still under negotiation with the company, but once those discussions are concluded, I would be quite happy to brief Mr Kelly on the details in relation to that point. And the Government continues to take a very close interest in the steps taken to implement this transaction.
Briefly, please, Maureen Watt.
Will the Cabinet Secretary join with me in congratulating the latest success of the now Two Sisters Food Group meat processing plant in Portlethen in my constituency, in that Tesco, who already take most of their meat products, have agreed to market premium high-value beef products in their leading stores, acknowledging the increasing demand for Scotland's top-quality beef, which is good news for retailers, processors and producers alike.
Cabinet Secretary.
I do welcome that, and obviously part of the Government's objective here has been to ensure that in relation to the various plants affected by the Two Sisters acquisition in Cambuslang, Mr Kelly's constituency, at Portlethen in Maureen Watt's constituency, and also Cooper Angus in my own constituency, that employment is sustained to provide clear outlets for quality Scottish agricultural produce. And not only is there significant employment vested in these three plants, but there is significant employment connected in the agricultural workforce around the country. So it's good to see what has been achieved at the Macintosh Donald plant at Portlethen, and obviously as part of the Government's discussions with Two Sisters, we will continue to promote the strength and the quality of Scottish produce, which is evidenced by the agreement that's been reached around Macintosh Donald.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, if you turn away from your microphone, unfortunately it becomes difficult for our official report to pick up. Question number 8, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what the West Scotland region's economic input is to the oil and gas sector.
Fergus.
Presiding Officer, Scottish Enterprise estimate that 15.5% of Scotland's high-growth oil and gas companies have operations located in the west of Scotland. That's 1 in 6. And these companies range in size from the Wood Group through to SMEs. Scotland's oil and gas strategy, announced last year by the First Minister and developed in conjunction with industry, lays out a plan to help the industry go from strength to strength, and through the strategy we aim to secure investment and maximise jobs.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank the Minister for that response. The Minister will be aware of the numerous companies in the west of Scotland who successfully participate in the oil and gas sector, such as James Walker Devole and Genda Energy, to name just two from Inverclyde. But what support can Scottish Enterprise and also Scottish Development International provide to manufacturing businesses from the west of Scotland to encourage more of them to actually take their first steps into the oil and gas sector, bearing in mind the huge economic success and the future potential that the sector is actually bringing to Scotland?
Minister.
Well, I know, Presiding Officer, that Stuart McMillan lobbies very hard and has a very close engagement with the companies in his area and wants to see even more companies join the successful ones in his part of Scotland. And he's quite right, because there are a huge number of companies in oil and gas that operate in the west of Scotland, and we would like to see even more join them. And I was happy to visit James Walker Devole in Greenock and see the excellent work that they do. So I think that members across the Chamber will want to see this progress, this work progressing. And in response to the question, Scottish Enterprise and SDEI can help companies in a great many ways, in particular in those areas in the west of Scotland. In some areas, regional selective assistance is available to encourage employment creation. That's a very good tool. It's been used very well in the past, and I fully intend it should be maximised in the future.
Question number 9, Claire Adamson.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what steps it is taking to promote hydrogen as a means of storing and distributing energy.
Fergus.
The Scottish Government has helped establish leading centres of excellence, such as the Pure Energy Centre in Unst and the Hydrogen Office in Methil. The Scottish universities are at the cutting edge of research and development in hydrogen and fuel cells, and we are also supporting the Aberdeen Hydrogen Project, which will deepen our understanding of the role hydrogen could play and enhance our reputation for energy innovation.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you. As far back as 2006, the Hydrogen Energy Group produced a report, Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Opportunities for Scotland, and concluded that hydrogen and fuel cell technology has the potential for 10,000 jobs, gross value addition to the Scottish economy of £500 million per annum, and almost certainly if we are to achieve our renewables targets, we will need this as one of the balanced and integrated diverse sources of energy. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how far we have gone in actually maximising the potential of this fuel technology?
Cabinet Secretary, before I call you, can I advise members that I've had a number of supplementary requests on the previous few questions. I'm afraid time is running away with us, and unfortunately it's difficult to take members who request supplementaries. Fergus.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. We are making progress. We want to make more progress. I've mentioned some examples. The hydrogen project in Aberdeen, for example, will help deliver a fleet of 10 hydrogen buses to Aberdeen, and that will be very welcome. Not least when this SNP government delivers the new Aberdeen Peripheral Road, which will tackle a long-standing problem, which, as I know from my frequent visits to Aberdeen, has caused serious problems for the people in that city. So I am very pleased to say that we are making progress, but more remains to be done.
Question number 10, Elaine Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth has had with his ministerial colleagues prior to allocating the most recent round of Barnett consequentials.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, Barnett consequentials accrue to the Scottish Bloc as a whole, and ministers take collective decisions about their allocation.
Elaine Murray.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. For your reply, the Cabinet Secretary stated in answer to S4W14615 that financial transactions totalling £290.8 million were available to the Scottish Government to support loans and equity investment and would have to be paid back to the Treasury in future years. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise whether the Scottish Government has considered using part of this funding to support loans to housing associations for the construction of homes for social rent, as many are experiencing problems securing loans from conventional sources such as banks?
Cabinet Secretary.
What I'd say to Dr Elaine Murray, and I think by the nature of her question she understands the difference between financial transactions and capital del that is available, and I can see that she recognises the difference there. The Government has set out the commitment to allocate the sums of money that have been referred to already, £290.8 million in financial transactions in relation to the housing sector. I am certain that some of that financial transaction capability will be utilised to support housing associations, but the Government continues to work with Her Majesty's Treasury to identify just the terms and the rules around which these financial transactions can be utilised, because we have to ensure that at no circumstance can any of the financial transaction facility lead to anything that could be construed as public expenditure, because that would defeat the nature of the classification of financial transactions. I'm happy to explain that in more detail to Dr Murray in writing, if that would be helpful, as we acquire the detailed understanding of what's involved in that respect.
Question number 11, Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how much the average household has saved since the introduction of the council tax freeze.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, over the 6-year period, the council tax freeze will have been in place from 2008 to 2014. The average Band D household in Scotland will have benefited from cumulative savings of almost £690.
Bruce Crawford.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Is the Cabinet Secretary aware that during Labour's last period in government in Scotland, the council tax in Aberdeen rose by 72%, leaving residents with the highest average bills in Scotland? Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that this makes the Labour Party candidate in Aberdeen Donside by-elections call for a hike in council tax bills particularly incomprehensible, considering that people there are living with household budgets that are already under huge pressure?
John Swinney.
Well, President, I think that the numbers speak for themselves, Presiding Officer. The SNP government has delivered the type of assistance to support hard-pressed families at their time of need under economic difficulties, whilst the Labour Party is talking about increasing their council tax bills. I think Mr Crawford summed it up very well. I don't think the Labour Party's position is in any way comprehensible on this subject.
Question number 12, Neil Finlay.
To ask the Scottish Government what recent discussions it has had with the banking sector regarding help for small businesses.
Ferguson.
The Scottish Government has regular discussions with the banking sector representatives on a range of issues, including access to finance for SMEs. We are actively encouraging the banks to return to acceptable levels of lending and improve the supply of finance for viable small and growing businesses. The recently published banking strategy sets a framework to work closely with the banks and others to restore the traditional principles of Scottish banking, based on probity, prudence and stewardship. It also encourages the banks to work with public agencies to enhance the quality of business loan proposals and so maximise the potential number of successful applications for finance.
Neil Finlay.
I've been approached by businessmen in my region who face the real prospect of going out of business because of the outrageous costs being imposed upon them by the Clydesdale Bank for breaking a commercial fixed-rate tailored business loan. My understanding is that this is a growing problem for many small and medium-sized businesses. What discussion has the Minister and the Finance Secretary had with the banking sector in Scotland about this developing mis-selling scandal that is threatening many small businesses?
Well, I should make it clear I don't adopt the terminology that the member raises, but nonetheless there is a serious point here about the alteration of terms of business to existing customers. This is a serious matter, and it has been raised regularly and repeatedly by myself and colleagues with banks. And I think all members will be aware of this. And this arises for a number of matters, including revaluation of assets on a conservative basis, which causes banks to review their lending policies. What I would say is a couple of things. We want banks to treat their customers fairly and decently, and we are absolutely clear about that. And secondly, if there is a decision which a customer disagrees with, then there is a right of appeal. And I can inform members that I am aware, from having seen the statistics, that those who appeal against decisions of banks, whether it is to decline lending or to change the terms of lending, enjoy a pretty high success rate in their appeals. Therefore, this is not a paper or nominal or negligible right of appeal. This is a serious one. And I am happy to write to Mr Finlay with details, the precise statistics of that, so that those constituents that have raised these matters with him can be sure that they have access to appeal if so advised.
Briefly, Stuart Maxwell.
Thank you. Can I welcome the recent announcement from the Deputy First Minister that project bank accounts speeding up payments to contractors involved in public sector projects will be trialled? Can the Minister outline how this measure, and indeed other work being taken forward by the Scottish Government, will help to support small businesses?
Minister.
Well, I think this is an extremely important measure indeed, because in the construction sector in particular, as Mr Maxwell will know, those who are in the position of subcontractors, or indeed subcontractors to subcontractors, often find that the time it takes for them to receive payment is far, far too long. In too many cases, that has led to or contributed towards insolvency situations. Project bank accounts are a way in which trusts can be used to administer payments so that small businesses get paid for the work that they do and they get paid on time. And a larger business is not sitting with their money in their bank account. That is why I was delighted that the Deputy First Minister has, on the recommendation of banking experts, taken forward a trial of project bank accounts. And I think it is a very, very good measure for project bank accounts. and I would like to pay tribute to the small businesses that lobbied us hard and whose views we have listened to by introducing trialling of project bank accounts.
Question number 13, Jim Hume.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government how much funding raised by the Public Health Supplement has been allocated to preventative spend initiatives.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the additional income raised by the Public Health Supplement, which is estimated to be £25 million in 2013-14, rising to £35 million in 2014-15, will help local government contribute to the decisive shift to preventive spend measures outlined in Spending Review 2011.
Jim Hume.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response, but the Minister will recall the controversy that surrounded the supplement's introduction, and it's important that every penny is spent. But after 2 months into the new financial year, I think we've learned today that this money is yet to be allocated. Why, when this government is looking for more powers, are they so slow to act on the powers and funding it actually has?
John Swinney.
I'm not sure I follow at all the point that Mr Hume is making. If he wants to write to me to explain the point, I'll happily consider it. But, for example, yesterday I had the enormous pleasure of attending a huge gathering of public sector staff, at the Early Years Collaborative in Glasgow, which is discussing and exchanging information and guidance about the achievements that have been made in various preventative spending interventions across the country. It was a most encouraging and inspiring event. So if that's not work happening on the ground, then I'm not quite sure what point Mr Hume is making, and that's being supported by the preventative spend expenditure that's been made available by the Scottish Government. Now, if there's something that I've missed in Mr Hume's question, he can drop me a note and I'll happily consider the issue.
Question number 14, Siobhan McMahon.
To ask the Scottish Government when it last met North Lanarkshire Council and what issues were discussed.
Derek Mackay.
The Scottish Government meets regularly with Scottish councils and discusses a range of issues with them.
Siobhan McMahon.
I recently met with the representatives of Airvolution Energy, who have submitted a planning application to North Lanarkshire Council for 9 wind turbines on land between Harthill, Eastfield and Shotts. I was pleased to learn of their commitment to use local expertise and resources to carry out the work associated with construction on the proposed wind farms. They are also keen to help increase local employment through promoting skills training and apprenticeships. What assurances can the Minister give that any future wind farm planning applications have a guaranteed provision for local employment opportunities, including skills training and apprenticeships, which will help to increase local employment and provide real community benefits?
Minister.
Of course, without prejudicing any planning application, because the member has referred to one, the point I was making earlier in an earlier question was around economic impact and the determination of any planning application, and therefore such issues would have a weighting within the system in terms of how that's being determined. Of course, separately, the Government is pursuing a procurement bill that also looks at social, environmental and local economic benefits as part of procurement, but clearly we'd want to ensure, as part of the renewable strategy, Scotland benefits from every aspect of that technology, every part of the supply chain, so that we maximise the benefits of the industry to local communities across Scotland.
Question 15, Rhoda Grant.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to support businesses in the Western Isles.
Fig Shewing.
The Scottish Government is working closely with a wide range of organisations, including the Council, HIE, to support businesses and promote sustainable economic growth in the Western Isles. HIE's investment of £1.4 million to create a site in Tarbert Harris has attracted a multi-million-pound private sector investment by Iliff Harris Distillers Limited. The construction of the distillery is being supported by the Scottish Government through a £1.9 million grant under the Food Processing, Marketing and Cooperation Grant Scheme. The development of the Creative Industries and Media Centre in Stornoway has been supported by over £1 million of ERDF and £750,000 from HIE in recognition of the employment opportunities offered by the creative sector in the Western Isles.
The Scottish Government has now had the impact report into the removal of RET for commercial vehicles in the Western Isles, Colin Tyree, for some weeks, and it shows that this policy has had a devastating effect on the island's businesses and economies. What action are they now taking to mitigate those catastrophic effects?
Fig Shewing.
Well, due to cuts imposed on the Scottish Government's budget by the UK Government, we have, it is correct, Presiding Officer, had to take difficult decisions to make sure that existing ferry routes and services are maintained. In response, therefore, we took the difficult decision to remove RET for large commercial vehicles from spring 2012. The results of the RET pilot showed that the major impact of RET was in fact on the tourism industry, as perhaps one might expect. I understand, however, that concessions have been introduced so that lorries carrying hay, livestock and live shellfish make the return empty journey for free, other than a charge to cover pier duties. The member will know that these matters are primarily dealt with by my colleague Keith Brown, and I am perfectly sure that if she wishes to make any specific proposal about additional expenditure, where it would be made and from how it would be funded, I am sure he would be happy to give that full consideration.
Thank you, Minister. Apologies to the many members that I could not call for supplementaries, and to those whose questions we did not reach. But that now ends portfolio questions, and we turn to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number